into the Hartwell estate. She carried nothing but a suitcase and a secret. They sent her away with nothing but a check and a threat. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that inside her. She carried the one thing their entire dynasty had been praying for across 3 desperate generations: an heir, the last Hartwell bloodline. And by the time they figured it out, she had already built an empire of her own from the ashes they left her in. This is not a fairy tale. This is a reckoning. Nadia Calloway had never owned anything worth more than $800. That was an honest assessment. At 26, she had a second-hand Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard, a studio apartment in the Glendale neighborhood of Cincinnati that she split unofficially with her tabby cat, biscuit, and a nursing degree she'd earned by working double shifts at a Waffle House for 3 straight years. She was, by every metric that the Hartwell family used to measure human worth. Nobody. But Sebastian Hartwell hadn't cared about metrics when he met her. He had cared about the way she argued with the hospital administrator at St. Vincent's Medical Center on behalf of a patient who couldn't speak English and had no one else in the room fighting for him. Sebastian had been visiting a colleague in the cardiac ward when he walked past room 214 and heard the voice not pleading, not apologetic, but firm and precise, laying out exactly why the patient's insurance classification needed to be re-evaluated before any discharge could legally occur. He stopped walking. He stood in the hallway for 6 full minutes, listening through the cracked door. Then he asked a passing orderly who she was. "Oh, that's Nadia," the orderly said, with the casual familiarity of someone describing a weather pattern. "She does that." They went on their first date 3 days later, coffee that turned into dinner, that turned into a 6-hour conversation about everything from childhood loneliness to the structural flaws in American healthcare policy. Sebastian was 34, the CEO of Hartwell Capital Group, a private equity firm managing nearly $4.2 billion in assets. He had a penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood, a weekend house in Door County, Wisconsin, and a family that had already decided long before he had who he was going to marry. Her name was Vivian Colton. Vivian was the daughter of Douglas Colton, the founder of Colton Meridian Trust, one of the 3 largest wealth management firms in the Midwest. The Colton-Hartwell merger had been discussed at dinner tables and in boardrooms long before Sebastian and Vivian had been teenagers. It wasn't arranged in any formal, documented sense. It was something more insidious than that. It was simply assumed. The way old money families assume. The way they build invisible architecture around their children and then act confused when the children feel trapped inside it. Sebastian's mother, Margaret Hartwell, was 61 years old, wore her silver hair in a rigid chignon, and had not once in her adult life allowed discomfort to show on her face. She collected rare orchids, funded a scholarship at Northwestern, and referred to people she didn't approve of as not particularly well suited. It was, everyone who knew her understood, the most devastating dismissal in her vocabulary. When Sebastian brought Nadia to the family's annual 4th of July gathering at the Lake Geneva estate, the first time he had ever brought a woman to that particular event without prior family approval, Margaret took one look at Nadia's department store sundress, her single strand of freshwater pearls, and her practiced but genuine smile, and something behind her eyes went absolutely still. "Not particularly well suited," she said to her daughter Courtney later, over gin and tonics on the back terrace. Courtney Hartwell was 31, beautiful in the calculated way of someone who had been taught that beauty was a resource to be managed, and she had already decided, within the first 40 minutes of Nadia's arrival, that this woman was a problem. The problem was not that Nadia was poor. Rich families had accommodated poor women before they called them projects in private and refreshingly genuine in public. The problem was that Nadia was not dazzled. She did not widen her eyes at the 12-bedroom estate. She did not fumble with the wrong fork at dinner. She did not fill silences with nervous laughter or over-explain her background to compensate for it. She simply existed, with a kind of self-contained steadiness that Margaret and Courtney found, separately and simultaneously, to be deeply threatening. And Sebastian looked at her the way none of the Hartwell men had ever looked at their wives. He looked at her like she was the only solid thing in the room. For 11 months, Sebastian and Nadia existed in a kind of double life. In Chicago, they were simply two people building something private and genuine weeknight dinners at her apartment, where she cooked, and he invariably tried to help, and invariably made things worse. Weekend farmers' markets in Lincoln Park, a November trip to Vermont that they hadn't planned, just driven to on a Thursday because Sebastian had looked across his office and thought, "I need to be somewhere that doesn't feel like obligation." And he had called her, and she had said, "Give me 20 minutes." But in the world of the Hartwells, they were a complication. Margaret orchestrated a campaign of quiet pressure with the efficiency of a general who has been winning long wars through patience rather than force. She arranged dinners that Sebastian was expected to attend, dinners where Vivian Colton was also in attendance, always seated adjacent to Sebastian, always polished and warm and gracious in the specific way that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." She forwarded Sebastian articles about the importance of shared background in long-term partnerships, as if they were casual reads. She mentioned Nadia perhaps twice in 6 months, and both mentions were delivered as observations rather than attacks. She seems like a lovely girl. Just a very different world, isn't it? Douglas Colton called Sebastian directly in February, which was unusual enough to signal that the families had been talking. The call was framed as a lunch invitation. It was understood as something closer to a summons. Courtney took a different approach. She befriended Nadia, or performed a version of friendship convincing enough that Nadia, who was fundamentally trusting and had not grown up among people who wielded warmth as a weapon, almost believed it. They had lunch twice. Courtney asked questions about Nadia's family, her mother in Dayton, her younger brother Derek, who was finishing his electrician's certification, her father who had left when Nadia was 9. Courtney listened with what appeared to be interest, and what was, in fact, research. The information was never used crudely. It was used the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, invisibly, in ways designed to leave the smallest possible scar on the surface while doing significant internal damage. A comment here about how different Nadia's life experiences must have been. A story there, told at a family dinner Sebastian wasn't at, about how Nadia had grown up in quite difficult circumstances, delivered with such apparent sympathy that it landed as condescension without ever technically being one. Sebastian knew, on some level, what was happening. But Sebastian Hartwell had a particular blindness that afflicted brilliant men who had been raised by powerful mothers. He consistently underestimated how much of his sense of reality had been shaped by the people who controlled his environment. He believed he was making independent choices. He believed that his family's behavior was uncomfortable but ultimately harmless. He believed, because he needed to, that love was something that existed outside of family politics. He was wrong about all of it. The breaking point came on a Saturday in early March, 13 months into their relationship. Nadia had taken a pregnancy test that morning, She sat on the bathroom floor of her apartment for a long time with the positive result in her hand, doing the specific kind of mathematics that women do when they are terrified and hopeful and uncertain all at once, calculating not just logistics, but meaning. She and Sebastian had talked about their future in the careful, elliptical way of two people who love each other and are both, for different reasons, afraid to name what they want directly. She did not know, in that moment, whether this news would be the thing that finally forced clarity between them, or the thing that ended everything. She called him. She told him to come over. He did, and she watched his face when she told him, and she saw before the smile came. Before he crossed the room and put his arms around her, she saw the flash of something complicated and frightened move through his eyes, like a cloud across a clear sky. She held on to the smile. She let herself not think about the cloud. That was her first mistake. Sebastian told his mother 2 weeks later. He told Nadia that the conversation had gone well. He said Margaret had been surprised, obviously, but supportive. He said they were going to have dinner with his family on Saturday, and that everything was going to be fine. Nadia dressed carefully for that dinner. Not to impress, she had given up on that particular aspiration months ago, but to feel like herself. She wore a deep green wrap dress, her hair down, minimal jewelry. She drove herself to the estate because Sebastian had a call that ran long, and she told him not to worry. She'd meet him there. She arrived before him. She was shown into the formal sitting room by the household manager, Gerald, who had worked for the Hartwells for 22 years, and who gave her a look of such precise and carefully neutral sympathy that she felt, for the first time, genuinely afraid. Margaret and Courtney were already seated. Vivian Colton was also in the room. Nadia stopped in the doorway. She looked at Vivian. She looked at Margaret. She understood, in the way that women understand things before they can fully articulate them, that she had walked into something that had been arranged before she arrived. "Come sit down, Nadia," Margaret said. Her voice was warm the way marble is warm when it's been sitting near a fire. The surface temperature is there, but the cold is still underneath, and you feel it if you stay long enough. What happened in the next 45 minutes was later reconstructed by Nadia in the way trauma is reconstructed, in fragments. Some vivid and some blurred at the edges. She remembered the specific things they said. She remembered less clearly the order in which they said them. Margaret led. She was gracious about it, which was the most brutal part. She spoke about Sebastian's responsibilities, about the Hartwell legacy, about what it meant to bring a child into a family of this kind. She used phrases like, "the child's best interests," and "what we're really talking about here is stability," and "I hope you understand this comes from a place of deep concern." Courtney provided the supporting structure, filling silences with gentle agreements, nodding in ways designed to signal to Nadia that this was simply reality being stated plainly rather than a verdict being delivered. Vivian said very little. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. The offer was presented in the final 10 minutes. It was framed as a support arrangement, not a payoff, a distinction Margaret maintained with the precision of someone who had clearly discussed the language with a lawyer. A lump sum of $300,000, access to a private physician throughout the pregnancy, and a mutually agreed-upon arrangement regarding the child's future. In exchange for Nadia's agreement to remove herself from Sebastian's life and to handle the situation in whatever way she felt was best, with the clear implication that best meant one specific thing. "Sebastian doesn't know you're doing this," Nadia said. It wasn't a question. Margaret held her gaze with the practiced steadiness of someone who had never once been cornered in her own house. "Sebastian knows what this family needs," she said, "even when he's temporarily unable to see it clearly." Nadia stood up. She did not cry. She would be grateful for that later, not because she thought crying was weakness, but because she needed, in that moment, for them to understand that she was not asking for their permission to exist. "I'm going to leave now," she said, "and I'm going to keep my baby. And I'm going to do it without your $300,000, because I don't need anyone's money to raise my child." She walked out of the sitting room. She walked through the foyer. Gerald held the front door open for her, and she thought she saw, in the line of his mouth, something that might have been respect. She drove home. She called her best friend, Petra Simmons, who had known Nadia since they were 15 and who drove over in 12 minutes and sat with her on the studio apartment floor while Nadia finally cried. She did not call Sebastian. Sebastian called her 6 times that evening. She did not answer. Here is what Sebastian did not do. He did not come to her door. He called. He texted. He sent a message through Petra that Petra delivered with the careful neutrality of a woman who was very much on Nadia's side, but also believed Nadia deserved to have accurate information. He says he didn't know what his mother was planning. He says he wants to talk. "I know he didn't plan it," Nadia told Petra. "That's almost the worst thing." What Sebastian not coming to her door meant what it would always mean. In Nadia's reading of it was that he was still at 34 years old. Making calculations, he was a man who genuinely loved her, and who was also, at the end of the day, standing in a house that his mother and grandfather had built, weighing love against legacy and not yet clear on which one he would choose. Nadia was 26. She had grown up in a house where choices were made for her by people who framed their control as protection, and she had spent the last decade of her life learning to trust her own read of situations. Her read of this situation was that waiting for Sebastian Hartwell to choose her was a form of slow disappearance she couldn't afford. So she disappeared first. She gave her landlord 30 days' notice. She called her mother in Dayton, who cried when Nadia told her about the pregnancy, and then, when she heard the rest of the story, stopped crying and said, Come home right now." She put her furniture in a storage unit, packed the Honda Civic until Biscuit could barely find a comfortable spot among the boxes, and drove the 3 hours to Dayton on a Wednesday morning in late March with the radio off and the windows cracked, and a feeling in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but something that lived exactly between them. Her mother, Carol Calloway, was 63, a retired school librarian who had raised Nadia and her brother Derek on a librarian's salary, and a stubborn belief that information was the one thing no one could take from you. Carol had a small brick house on Elmwood Avenue, with a garden that got too ambitious every spring, and a spare bedroom with yellow walls that Nadia had always loved. "You'll stay here as long as you need," Carol said. "And when you're ready, you'll figure out what's next. You always do." The pregnancy was uncomplicated. Physically, Dr. Renee Hoffman, an OBGYN at Dayton Children's, became one of the most stable presences in Nadia's life during those 8 months, methodical, warm in a specifically unsentimental way that Nadia found deeply comforting. Every appointment was concrete. Every number was explained. There was something almost therapeutic about the clinical precision of monitoring a developing life with someone who treated the science as sacred and the worry as manageable. Nadia began studying for her NCLEX specialty certification in maternal fetal medicine. It was partly practical, she needed better income, and partly something she couldn't entirely explain, an instinct that this experience was teaching her something she was supposed to carry forward professionally. She did not contact Sebastian. Sebastian tried twice more, once through Petra, once through a handwritten letter that arrived at her Cincinnati apartment, forwarded by her landlord in a forwarding envelope, so crumpled it suggested the letter had taken a complicated journey to find her. She read the letter. It was honest and anguished, and full of the specific kind of love that lives in people who are also, simultaneously, failing you. She kept it. She did not respond. She told herself, and believed it, that she was doing the right thing for herself, for her baby, for everyone involved. If Sebastian couldn't find his way to her without coordinates, then the geography of his love wasn't reliable enough to build anything on. What she did not account for, because she was 26 and surviving and couldn't afford to look too far ahead, was what happened when the Hartwell family eventually found out. The baby was born on a Tuesday in November, a boy, 8 pounds, 2 ounces. Perfect in the way that only new things can be perfect, not flawless, but complete. Nadia held him for 2 hours before she let anyone else in the room. She counted his fingers. She memorized the specific weight of him against her chest. She named him Thomas Richard Calloway. Thomas for no particular reason, except that it felt sturdy and honest. And Richard, because it had been her grandfather's name. The man who had taught her to play chess and told her, when she was 7, that the most important skill in any game was knowing when not to move. Carol came in first. She held Thomas and wept in the quiet way of someone who has learned, over 63 years, that some emotions are too large for noise. Derek came with flowers that were slightly too many and slightly too cheerful, which was exactly right. Petra drove from Cincinnati with a diaper bag that cost more than Nadia's monthly grocery budget. "You're going to need good gear," Petra said, in the voice of someone who had researched this extensively. For 3 days, Nadia existed in the specific bubble that new mothers know, exhausted and transformed and enclosed in something that hadn't existed the week before. A world shrunk to the size of a baby's face and expanded, simultaneously, to fill everything. Then, on the 4th day, she checked her bank account. 0. Not literally 0, she had savings, carefully guarded, but the number she saw when she looked at the balance told her, more clearly than anything else could have, that the next chapter was going to require something different from her. She made a list. It was what Carol had taught her when you don't know what to do. Make a list of what you know, what Nadia knew. She had a nursing degree and nearly 2 years of specialty certification completed. She had a mother who would help with Thomas. She had Petra, who was a marketing director at a mid-sized healthcare firm, and who had been telling her for 2 years, with increasing urgency, that she had the mind and the communication skills to do something beyond the hospital floor. She also knew something else, something she had been turning over since the Hartwell sitting room, since the polished offer of $300,000, since the clarity of walking out of that house. She knew how the medical billing system failed vulnerable patients. She had been watching it fail them for 5 years at the bedside level, She knew exactly where the gaps were, who fell through them, and what it would cost to build something that caught them. She had an idea. The company was called Bridgepoint Health Navigation. It started, genuinely started, at Carol Calloway's kitchen table in Dayton, Ohio, in February, when Thomas was 3 months old and sleeping in a bouncy chair next to the table, and Nadia was drinking her 4th cup of coffee of the morning and explaining to Petra, for the 2nd time in a week, how hospital billing advocates could reduce patient debt by an average of 40 to 60% if deployed at the right point in the care cycle. "How do you know that?" Petra asked. "Because I've been doing it informally for 5 years, Nadia said. "I just wasn't getting paid for it." Petra was quiet for a moment, in the specific way she went quiet when she was running projections in her head. Then she said, "So we make a company that does it formally. I don't have capital. I have savings. What do you need to start?" They registered the LLC in March. They secured their first contract, a small community health clinic in Yellow Springs that was overwhelmed with billing disputes in May. They hired their first employee, a medical billing specialist named Owen Baxter, who had been working for a hospital system in Columbus, and who came to his first interview at a coffee shop in Dayton, looked at their pitch materials for 20 minutes, and said, "This is going to work. When do I start?" What happened over the next 2 years was not magic. It was the particular grinding, unglamorous, relentless kind of work that doesn't make good television, but builds real things. Nadia worked from Carol's kitchen table until Thomas was sleeping through the night. Then she converted the garage into an office. Then she rented a space on 5th Street in Dayton's downtown small, with parking problems and a radiator that made alarming sounds in January. Petra handled the marketing and client development. Owen handled the operational systems. Nadia handled everything else, which was most of it. Bridgepoint's model was straightforward. They contracted with healthcare providers to provide billing navigation services to uninsured or underinsured patients, reducing provider bad debt while dramatically cutting patient financial liability. They worked on contingency for the first 6 months, no savings. No fee until word spread. By the end of year 1, they had 12 client facilities. By the end of year 2, they had 43, spread across 4 states. Nadia was 29, and she was no longer driving a Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard. Thomas grew. He was... Nadia thought with the specific wonder of a mother who cannot be objective and knows it. Extraordinary in entirely ordinary ways. He was curious about everything. He lined up his toy cars by color and then by size, which Carol said meant he was a little scientist, and which Petra said meant he was a little CEO. He called Carol Grand C and Derek Uncle D-Rock, a name Derek claimed to find embarrassing and clearly loved. He did not know what a Hartwell was. He did not need to. The first sign that something was shifting in the Hartwell universe came through Petra's phone. Courtney Hartwell's assistant had emailed Petra's work address, their work address, meaning someone had been paying close enough attention to know where Nadia now worked, with a message requesting a brief introductory conversation at Ms. Hartwell's convenience. Petra forwarded it to Nadia with a single line. "They know something. What do you want to do?" Nadia looked at the email for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her lawyer. Her lawyer was a woman named Rebecca Strand, who had been recommended by a healthcare industry contact and who operated out of Columbus with the specific quietude of someone who did not need to perform competence. Rebecca had helped structure Bridgepoint's contracts, reviewed their insurance agreements, and handled 2 difficult client disputes with the precision that had made Nadia, from the first meeting, feel genuinely protected. "Tell them nothing," Rebecca said. "Not yet. Let me find out what they're looking for." What happened inside the Hartwell family between March of Nadia's departure and the following autumn was, in its own way, a kind of unraveling. Sebastian and Vivian Colton's relationship, the one that had been assumed and structured and set in social concrete before either of them was old enough to consent to it, had ended in August. Not dramatically. Margaret had not cried. Douglas Colton had made a call to his attorney regarding business arrangements that would need to be restructured. Vivian had moved to New York to take a position at a philanthropic foundation she'd long been interested in. Everyone was very adult about it, as Courtney said, in the voice of someone describing a funeral. The reason for the end was simple, and never stated directly in the Hartwell household. Sebastian could not love Vivian the way he had loved Nadia, and Vivian, who was, underneath the polish and the positioning, a person with her own private sense of dignity, was not willing to be in a marriage with someone who was emotionally elsewhere. Sebastian had told his therapist, Dr. Allison Park in Chicago, that he felt like he had stood at a crossroads and chosen the wrong path, and then realized, too late, that the path was not actually a road at all, but a painting of a road on a wall. Dr. Park had noted, carefully, that the wrong path imagery was interesting given that he had technically chosen the path his family wanted, not the one he had wanted himself. He had not responded to that observation verbally, but he had thought about it for 3 weeks. He hired a private investigator in early September. The PI, a man named Gary Hollis, who worked out of Cincinnati and who had 17 years of experience and a manner so aggressively unremarkable that he could stand in any room and not be remembered. Found Nadia Calloway in Dayton in 2 weeks. He found Bridgepoint Health Navigation. He found the Elmwood Avenue address. He found, in the public records and through his own careful observation, a small boy with Nadia's dark hair and, according to his report, notably similar features to client photographs. Sebastian had sat in his Chicago office with the report in his hands for a long time. Then he had called his mother. Margaret's response was not what Sebastian expected. He had expected denial, or perhaps the specific, cool deflection she was expert at. What he got instead was silence, a silence that lasted long enough to confirm, without a word being spoken, that Margaret had known there was a pregnancy before he had, that her offer in that sitting room had included a specific option, that she had, in other words, known he might have a child, and had tried to ensure that child did not exist. "How long have you known?" Sebastian asked. The silence continued. "Mother." "We did what we thought was best for the family," Margaret said finally. Her voice was entirely controlled. "You were not in a position to think clearly. You had responsibilities." He hung up. It was the first time Sebastian Hartwell had hung up on his mother in 34 years. He called Courtney next. Courtney was more forthcoming, perhaps because she had been carrying something that felt heavier than she'd expected. She confirmed the evening with Nadia, the offer, the $300,000. She confirmed that they had known Nadia was pregnant. She had not, she said. And here her voice shifted into something that might have been genuine, anticipated that Nadia would simply disappear entirely. "What did you think she would do?" Sebastian asked. Courtney had no answer. Sebastian called Gerald, the household manager, the man who had opened the door for Nadia that night, who had worked for the family for 22 years. Gerald answered on the second ring. He told Sebastian, in the measured language of a man who had waited a long time to say something, that Heir. Calloway had left the estate that night with extraordinary dignity. That he had felt, watching her go, that the family had made a serious error, that he was glad Sebastian had called. Then Sebastian Hartwell drove to Dayton. He did not tell anyone he was going. He did not coordinate it. He drove his own car, not the town car, not the driver, a 3-hour drive on a Thursday morning, and he arrived in front of a brick house on Elmwood Avenue in the early afternoon. He sat in the car for 20 minutes. Then he got out. Carol Calloway opened the door before he rang the bell. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been expecting something for 2 years and is not going to pretend otherwise. "He's not here," she said. "He's at the park with Derek. But you should come in." She made him coffee. She sat across the table from him. She did not make things easier for him, and she did not make them harder. She simply looked at him with the steady, clear-eyed attention of a woman who had spent 40 years helping children navigate books and, through books, the world. "She built something remarkable," Carol said, "while you were wherever you were. I need you to understand that before anything else." "I know," Sebastian said. "I've seen the reports." "Not reports," Carol said, with a sharpness that was not unkind, but was absolutely precise. "My daughter. I need you to understand who my daughter is before you go trying to fit her back into your story." Sebastian nodded. He understood that he was being told something important. "Does she know I'm here?" he asked. "She knows you came to Dayton," Carol said. "I texted her when you sat in your car for 20 minutes. She's deciding whether to come home." Nadia arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon. She came through the back door, the kitchen door, the door that went directly to the garden, and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of Sebastian Hartwell, sitting at her mother's kitchen table with a coffee mug in both hands, and the expression of a man who has been reduced by circumstance and by his own failures to something more honest than he usually got to be. He looked older, not badly older, just more like a person and less like a presentation. She sat down across from him. Carol quietly took her coffee into the living room and closed the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You have a son," Nadia said finally. She wanted it named immediately, clearly, without the cushioning of euphemism. "His name is Thomas. He's 2. He has your hands." Sebastian closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in them that Nadia recognized as grief, not for what he'd lost in general, but for the specific mornings and evenings and first words and first steps that had already happened without him, and could not be recovered. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know what they did until I know you didn't plan it." Nadia said, "I've always known that. That was never the thing I was angry about." "What were you angry about?" "You didn't come," she said simply. "When I stopped answering, you stopped trying. You let 6 months pass and sent a letter, and then you let another year pass, and in that time, your family tried to erase me, and you were somewhere else, making peace with something I don't think you should have made peace with." The silence was long enough to be honest. "I know," he said. "I don't want your apology right now," Nadia said. "I want to know what you want. Not from me, from him, from Thomas. What do you want to be his father?" Sebastian said. "Whatever that looks like, whatever you decide that means. To start, I know I don't get to come in and set terms." Nadia looked at him for a long time. She was doing the calculation she had always been good at, not the emotional one, which was tangled and complicated and would take a long time to work through. But the practical one, what was safe for Thomas, what was real versus what was promising, what a father was versus what a man standing in a kitchen after 2 years saying he wanted to be one was. "Rebecca Strand is my lawyer," she said finally. "You'll need to work with her to establish paternity and parenting agreements, legal process. Sebastian, all of it through proper channels. Of course. And I need you to hear me on something before you meet him." She leaned forward slightly. "He is not a Hartwell heir. He is Thomas Calloway. He is my son. Whatever legal arrangements we make, whatever relationship you build with him, he comes into that as himself, not as a dynasty continuation, not as a chess piece. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Sebastian said, "and I agree with you. Your mother cannot be in his life until I'm confident she understands that he is a child and not an asset. Courtney I'm undecided on. Those aren't negotiations, they're my conditions." "Understood." She stood up. She went to the back door and opened it and called Derek's cell. She told him to bring Thomas home. Thomas arrived 8 minutes later, carried on Derek's shoulders, holding a stick he had found at the park with the serious satisfaction of someone who has found exactly the object they were looking for. He was dropped onto the kitchen floor, where he immediately investigated Sebastian with the unfiltered curiosity of a 2-year-old, which meant standing directly in front of him at close range and staring with enormous focus. Sebastian looked at his son. His son looked back. "Hi," Thomas said. "Hi," Sebastian said. His voice broke on the word, just slightly, just enough. "Want to see my stick?" Thomas asked. "Very much." Sebastian said, Margaret Hartwell came to Dayton on a Tuesday in December. 2 months after Sebastian's first visit to Elmwood Avenue, she didn't send an assistant ahead of her. She did not arrange the meeting through a lawyer or a household manager or any of the intermediaries that a woman of her position typically deployed between herself and anything that made her uncomfortable. She drove herself her own car, a silver Mercedes she rarely touched, because Gerald usually drove her everywhere, and she arrived 12 minutes early, which Nadia knew because Carol had been watching through the front window with the focused attention of a woman who understood that the timing of an arrival tells you something about the person making it. "She's sitting in her car," Carol reported from her post by the curtain. "Has been for 8 minutes." "Good," Nadia said. She was in the kitchen, not because she needed to be in the kitchen, but because standing in a room with something to do with her hands was how she managed situations that required her to be more composed than she felt. She was washing dishes that were already clean. When the doorbell finally rang, Carol opened it. She looked at Margaret Hartwell, at the silver chignon, the tailored wool coat, the single strand of diamonds that probably cost more than the Elmwood Avenue house, and said nothing for a moment that lasted just long enough to make its point. Then she opened the door wider and said, "Come in," in the voice she used for parents at school who had let her down but were getting one more chance. Nadia had decided, after considerable thought, that this meeting would happen in the living room, not the kitchen, which was warm and informal and felt like Carol's territory in a way that Nadia wanted to protect, not the backyard, which was too casual, the living room, with its slightly stiff furniture and the framed photographs on the side table and the reading lamp that cast things in a light that was honest without being harsh. A room that said, "This is a serious conversation, and we are going to have it properly." She waited until she heard the living room door close behind Carol before she dried her hands and walked in. Margaret was seated on the wingback chair, not the sofa, which would have required her to share space side by side with someone, but the chair that faced the sofa directly, which put her in a position of eye contact. Nadia noted this with the part of her brain that was always quietly observing, even in a situation where she had come to apologize. Margaret Hartwell sat like a woman who understood positioning. Nadia sat on the sofa. She did not offer coffee. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. For a moment. Margaret said nothing. She looked at Nadia with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read, not the practiced warmth as weapon she had deployed at their first meetings, not the cool authority of the Lake Geneva estate, but something more stripped down. She looked, Nadia thought, like a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say many times and was now questioning every version of it. "I was wrong," Margaret said finally. The words came out with the precision of someone who has not said them often enough to make them easy, but who has decided to say them anyway. "I treated you as a threat to something I valued, when you were a person I should have seen. I'm sorry for what happened in my house that evening. I'm sorry for the offer that was made, and for what it implied, and for the position it put you in. I'm sorry it took me this long." Nadia held the silence for a moment. Not to be cruel, she wasn't interested in cruelty, but because she had learned, in 3 years of building something from nothing, that the instinct to immediately relieve someone else's discomfort was not always a generous one. Sometimes it was just conflict avoidance dressed up as kindness. Margaret's discomfort in this room was honest and appropriate, and filling it too quickly would let them both pretend the apology had landed softer than it needed to. "That apology is the beginning of something," Nadia said finally. "It's not the end of it. I need to see what comes after the apology. Not just the apology itself." Margaret nodded. She did not argue. She did not qualify. "I have some things I need you to understand," Nadia continued, "about how this works going forward. If it works at all. Thomas is 2 years old. He doesn't know what a Hartwell is. He doesn't know what a legacy is, or what an estate is, or what it means to have a grandfather who built a company. What he knows is that he has a grandmother named Grancy who reads him books and lets him help in the garden, and an uncle who carries him on his shoulders, and a mother who is always there when he wakes up scared. That is the entire architecture of his world right now, and I will not allow that world to be reorganized around his grandfather's portfolio or your family's expectations of what this child is supposed to become." "I understand," Margaret said. "I'm not sure you do yet," Nadia said, not unkindly, "because for your whole life, children in your family have been understood primarily in terms of what they will eventually represent. Continuity. Legacy. The next chapter of something that was started before they were born. And I know that's not malicious. I understand that world. I've studied it. But Thomas is not going to be understood that way. Not by anyone who wants to be in his life. He's going to be understood as a person first, and as anything else, a very distant second." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite pain, but was adjacent to it, the expression, Nadia thought, of someone recognizing a true thing about themselves that they have been, for a long time, successfully not looking at. "He has Sebastian's hands," Margaret said. The words came out quietly, almost involuntarily, like something that had been held back and finally slipped through. Nadia softened. "Just slightly." not because the observation required her to, but because it was human, and she was not here to win something. She was here to decide what was possible. "I know," she said. "He also has my stubbornness, so prepare yourself." Something in Margaret's face shifted fractionally, carefully, but unmistakably into something that was not quite a smile, but was the ghost of one. "Here is what I'm willing to offer," Nadia said. "You may be in Thomas's life, if the next year demonstrates that you can meet him as a child and not as an inheritance. Sebastian has visitation, now legal, structured, through the agreement Rebecca and his attorney finalized. When he has Thomas, there may be occasions where you are present. Those occasions will be at Sebastian's discretion, and mine, not yours to arrange or to request. If you are present, and I receive any indication from Sebastian or from Thomas himself, as he gets older, that he is being introduced to this family's expectations of him, rather than simply being known as himself, those occasions stop permanently. Are we clear?" "Perfectly," Margaret said. "Courtney will need to come to me herself," Nadia added. "If she wants a relationship with Thomas, she asks me directly, not through Sebastian, not through you, not through anyone else. She comes to me, and she has an honest conversation about what happened and what she's willing to do differently. I'll hear her out." Margaret nodded again. "That's fair," she said. And then, in a voice that was almost entirely controlled, but not quite, "He looks like his father did. At that age, I saw a photograph Sebastian showed me. He looks—" She stopped herself, cleared her throat. "He looks healthy. He's extraordinary," Nadia said, and did not try to make it sound modest, because it wasn't. When Margaret left 40 minutes later, Carol appeared silently in the living room doorway with 2 cups of tea, as though she had been waiting precisely the right amount of time to make her entrance. "How'd it go?" Carol asked. "She apologized," Nadia said. "She meant it. I think, at least the part she's capable of meaning right now. And the rest? The rest is behavior," Nadia said. "We'll see." Carol handed her the tea and sat down in the wingback chair Margaret had vacated, claiming the room back in the quiet, territorial way of a woman who has lived in this house for 30 years and knows every inch of it. She looked at her daughter with the particular expression she had been giving Nadia since Nadia was 7 years old, and had made a difficult decision, not pride exactly. Because Carol found pride too simple for complicated situations, but something more like recognition. "Your grandfather would have handled that exactly the way you just did," Carol said. Nadia thought of Thomas Richard, of chess pieces, sanded smooth for small hands, of the instruction to know when not to move. She thought of her son asleep upstairs in the yellow-walled room, his stick from the park propped against the baseboard because he had insisted it needed to come inside. "I'm learning," Nadia said. "You're not," Carol said gently. "You already know. You've known for a long time. You're just finally in a place where you get to use it." Nadia wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth settle into her palms. Outside, a December wind moved through the garden, through Carol's over-ambitious beds and bare-stemmed rose bushes and the corner where the tomatoes had been. Before the frost took them, and for the first time in 3 years. Nadia did not feel the cold as something that had been done to her. She felt it simply as weather, as the ordinary, survivable kind of thing that comes every year and passes, and that the garden grows back from without being asked. She walked out of that mansion with nothing, No money, no support, no name on a door. And 3 years later, she had built something no amount of Hartwell money could have bought her: a company, a son, and a life that was entirely and completely hers. This story is a reminder that the people who underestimate you are never the ones who determine your ceiling. Nadia didn't wait for rescue. She didn't take the check. She didn't let anyone else hold the pen. And that made all the difference. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that real. Human stories matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who's been pushed out, counted out, or told they don't belong somewhere they deserved to be. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we tell these kinds of stories every week. Stories of resilience, of quiet power, of people who built empires on the rubble of what others threw away. Your next chapter starts the moment you stop waiting for someone else to write it.